Hello and welcome to part 5, where we're going to get back to the hornbill in a moment and start to put the finishing touches on the bird, get those feathers looking great. But before I do, I just want to refine the edge of the tree line where it meets the cliffs. We just have to make that smooth transition from cliff to forest canopy and then all the way forward to the bird. We have to just get the right balance of colours and tones there before I can then say to myself, well, the top section is all done, it's time to switch my attention to the bottom section, put those finishing touches on the hornbill, and then move into the final details on all the bushes at the bottom. So final details going in here. Notice the approach. First I balanced the colours and the tones, and now I'm moving in with that green just to pick out some of the leaves, the little bit of detail, and then on top of that I'm putting all these straggly little vines and branches. Only now do we see detail going in. None of it before was really detail. People overrate detail in the pursuit of realism. They think that detail is what gives you the realism, but it's really not the case. Detail is just one aspect of realism, and it's certainly not the most important aspect either. Realism comes from everything working together, the tonal values, the colour, and then the detail. The detail is just the icing on the cake. And here we have a cake that needs some icing. I decided that the feathers were a little bit too white. The bird is backlit in the rainforest here, so it's not going to be pure white. We want some colour. Again, it's this judgment process, thinking about our exact colours, hues and tones. And if we're going to make detail lines, final strokes that are going to be white, then in order for them to show up, they have to go on top of a slightly off-white base. So that's what I'm building here, a little bit of colour, and then I can put some shadow and detail on top of that. And I'm also mindful that with an extra layer of light pastel, it's going to give it more luminosity. And that's going to be very important, because this is a real feature in this painting, isn't it? I want people's eye to be drawn towards the hornbill. That's very important. It's very important in all paintings, really, that you decide where your main focus is going to be. You don't put the full focus everywhere in a painting, because then people don't know where to look. So we decide on what the main focal point is going to be, and we throw all our efforts there to bring the viewer's eye to that point. And with that in mind, I'm putting pure white on the edge there, just where the light is catching the edge. Using a stick to make it as powerful as I possibly can, I want those edges to be crisp and sharp and to stand out. There are lots of accent colours going in here, just tinting the white of those feathers. I very rarely leave an area as pure white. Whites generally pick up the colours around them. So that's what I'm doing here, just adding some of those colours. It's the same with black. Black and white, I do use them both, but always remember that they're the absolute extremes of the scale. And most of the time, your blacks will have other colours in them, and your whites also will reflect the colours around them. Use black or white by all means, but use them very sparingly. Only the very brightest of things, or the very, very darkest of things. Everything else is colour, rich, beautiful colour. More shadowing going in. It's an incredibly light touch that's needed here. These are white feathers, of course, so these colours have to be very, very subtle. Nothing too drastic, nothing too sharp. Just very, very subtle colours that will then enable the final white strokes to stand out very clearly. It's definitely a fine balancing act, this bit on the tail, because we also need to get a little bit of that cross-hatching effect, just to show the structure of the feather. It's all got to come together at some point so that it'll just look right, in a way that's harmonious with all its surroundings. The colours, if you notice, are very similar to the colours of the branch. That's because everything is under the same lighting conditions. So I want everything just to feel that it belongs there. and the pure white just to finish those edges. It's the Faber-Castell pure white pastel square stick. Very, very beautiful white, that is. It makes a very, very bright line. And don't forget to notice how sharp it was. And now I turn my attention to the dark parts of the feathers. Not just black, of course. They're going to be quite dark because the bird is backlit. But I don't want to just use a black because that would be a very dead colour to use. So I'm putting in those rich purples that I've used in all the shadows in the painting. Which again is all about harmony, isn't it? Colour harmony throughout the work. So putting a bit of a base with purpley tone in, and there's a little black underneath, that's giving us the darkness that we need. And I'm using the black pencil, very sharp, just to define some of the straighter lines and some of the detail. But basically that darkness has to be a bit of a rich colour, so I'll be toning that with other colours just to make it look a bit more interesting. Stabilo Carbothellos are a fine pencil for this sort of thing. But I think I would have also used the Caran D'ache pastel pencils quite a lot on the brighter parts of this tail, if I'd had them at that time. And so with the hornbill starting to look really nice, it's time to turn our attention to the area surrounding those feathers. Let's get that sorted, and that will make the feathers stand out even more. So turning my attention to these long leaves, I'm working from a dark to light perspective here. I'm punching in some of the deepest shadow tones, and then I can start to bring the lighter colours forward on top of that. I'm using a mid-tone green here. There are going to be many greens used in this particular bush. Some of the greens represent more shadowed areas. Other greens will represent where the leaves are moving towards the light, and then there'll be a much lighter green, a whitish green, to represent the highlights. And using these three different variations of the green and also the black for the deep shadows, we should be able to create quite a three-dimensional realistic effect here. I'm using this green Conte stick just to bring a little bit more colour to the area. I thought it was lacking in a little bit of vibrance. So, as usual, I'll turn to a stick and just put that colour in before I get back to some more detailed strokes. I'm trying to break things up here a little bit with the pale olive green. I don't want things to look regimented and contrived, so I'm adding a bit of chaos to my strokes, putting some going in directions that are sort of contrary to the general flow of the leaves. I think it's very important to do that in any fur work or when you're doing hair. It seems to be a tendency we all have. The human brain likes pattern, doesn't it? It likes to create pattern, and if you're not on the ball with this, you find yourself falling into a pattern where you'll do a series of lines all in the same direction, and then you wonder why it looks false. So that's exactly what my mindset is here. I'm just changing that, breaking it up a bit and making it a little more scruffy, so to speak, more organic and natural. And here once again we're just adding a little accent colour, just skimming in a little warmer tone to those shadowy areas. All these little things just help to make it look more appealing to the eye and a little bit more complex and real looking. Sometimes this process of getting the right colours and tones and then getting the shadows and then the highlights, sometimes we repeat this over and over on the same piece, each time just bringing a little bit more to the area and a little bit more, until eventually, if your patience holds out, eventually it starts to look just the way you want it to. But you do need to have patience, and you do need to have a kind of a inner determination that no matter what it takes, you'll keep going until it meets that vision that you have of it in your own mind. You keep going until those darks are dark enough, until your highlights are pure and crisp enough, and until your basic colours and tones are exactly where you want them to be. You judge all the things together, and only when you're happy with all of those areas do you move on to the next area, or return to a neighbouring area just to bring it up to the same level and to balance it with the area that you've just done. It's one of the things I do regularly on a painting. I just bring a certain part up to a certain level, then I'll move on to a neighbouring area, and then go round the entire painting again that way, just bringing everything up so that everything eventually is at the same completed level. That's what I'm doing here, just balancing those two bushes so that the light falling upon them is balanced and they look like they belong next to each other. And looking at both of these foreground bushes together, I decided a little bit more work was needed on this bush on the right hand side. It's very near the focal point where the hornbill is, so I wanted it to be a bit of a feature. It's also a little bit striking because it's very different to a lot of the other foliage that's in this jungle scene, so I thought it needed just that little bit of an extra touch or two. And having got those bushes where I wanted them to be, it's time to zoom out and take a look at the picture as a whole and to assess everything together once again. And what I decided here was I needed a little bit more of some atmosphere going in to the picture now, just to bring the foreground bushes and the hornbill further into the foreground. So this just sets the background back a little, and what I'm going to do now is work down towards the bottom of the painting, that bottom right area that needs attention. So let's move down towards that area and have a look what we can do just to make that look a little bit better. It obviously needs a little bit more detailing, a little bit more vibrance of colour, but we've got to be careful as well not to compete with those feathers. We still have to keep it thrown back a little bit. Again, it's a balancing act. So as we get towards the bottom of the painting, detailing becomes a little bit more important because we're getting a little bit nearer. I was imagining the detail sort of curving off and upwards. So here, this is a lot more in need of sort of fine vines and leaves all over the place, and perhaps a bit more accent colours to go in. I want that area to look rich and complex. And that complexity will set the stage for these very dramatic leaves, which we're going to have right over on the right hand side of the painting, which draw the eye in. It's a feature, isn't it? It's a foreground feature, so we have to make this area stand out and look really, really good. So I'm going to take my time here. Lots of subtle colours, lots of highlighting. I want everything to be slightly bolder in this area here. So I'm going to be applying lots of pigment, lots of layers. I want the effect that when you look at this painting from a distance, these greens will stand out a lot more. So more layers here. That's important, and richer, more vibrant colours. I actually enjoyed this area very much. I didn't have any reference for it, it was all from my imagination, so I had much more freedom to play around with the shapes and the light and the colour. Remember at the start of this painting when I was saying how I was using a white version of the pastel mat for the first time on this painting because I thought it would be helpful at the top, and I suppose it was, but on reflection, and ever since I painted this, I've never used the white again. I always use the mid-tone grey. For some reason they call it dark grey, but it's actually a mid-tone grey, and that's my favourite version of Clairefontaine Pastelmat. I like the mid-tone version because it really helps when you're establishing your tonal values. You always refer to the grey that's on the pastel mat surface. You're always mindful that that is a mid-grey, so you're comparing whatever you're doing. Is it lighter than this or darker than this? If you're painting on a black or a white, then you're at the extreme ends of your tonal range, so that becomes a little bit more difficult to judge your tonal values, and for that reason I would recommend people to use the grey pastel mat, which is a mid-tone. It's true that none of the surface remains to be seen when the painting is finished, so in that sense it doesn't really matter what colour you start with. But it's during the process of painting that it's really helpful if it's just a neutral mid-tone grey. If you have a bright colour, say a blue or a red, it can be very off-putting when you're trying to judge colour. So for me it's definitely the neutral grey Clairefontaine Pastelmat. Notice how I'm deliberately making things a little bit scruffy here. I don't want it to look too perfect. It's a very important thing to keep in your mind that when you're painting anything that's organic, don't make it too neat and tidy. The more scruffy you make it, the more organic and natural it'll look. And now we're just about reaching the end of part 5 of this DVD. I hope you're enjoying it, and I'll see you in part 6.